You want, you can hold.
Thank you very much. And I want to say Dankjewel out loud. I want to say Dankjewel to many people, and particularly to Thomas Johans, who's here, I know somewhere, and to dear Bart Eckhout for inviting me to participate in this very exciting festival in Antwerp. And you know, I was saying earlier that I've been to Antwerp, and now this is my 4th time, and I love this city really and truly very much. It's so beautiful, and people have always been so kind and friendly to me here, and very just welcoming. So it's nice to be back, and it's very exciting to participate in the festival here and to see what you're doing. I wish that I could see more of it, more of what's happening, but maybe I'll be able to read about it on the internet. So I'm just going to read a very brief section of something that is from a work in progress. And can all of you hear me up in the top? Okay, good. What I'm going to do, this is a piece that is dealing with childhood, my childhood in Jamaica, and looking at the ways that people in my family talked about many things that we weren't supposed to talk about and that we still don't discuss, like homosexuality. And so many of my aunts and uncles and my grandparents always had things to say about homosexuality and other things as well. So I'm going to read a few things that they said, and I'm very glad that I actually wrote these down at the time, because some of them are rather, I think, unbelievable. When they're in Jamaican patois and not in English, I will translate for you if you don't get the sense of what is being said. I don't know if anybody here speaks Jamaican patois, but it's okay, I don't speak Flemish, Dutch. So, these were remarks that I heard in childhood in Jamaica in youth. My Uncle Dudley. The English are a wonderful set of people, you see? The only problem is that almost all of the men are homosexuals. A woman heard outside Parish Church in Kingston about 1976. This is in patois, and I'll translate it. Well, batty man can't swim, you know, because them take on water in them batty hole. The whole of them would have dead if them had ever tried to swim in the sea. Gay men can't swim because they'll take on water in their rectums and drown. And so for that reason, they can't go near the sea. A female friend of my mother's, the English people, them is a sweet people, you know, sweet and precious. But I think that one problem them have is that the man them have no kind of cocky. English men are lovely and English people are sweet, but the men always have small penises. An insult hurled by a woman who worked for my uncle, one of my uncles, an insult hurled by this woman to a road worker who had made the mistake of getting into a quarrel with her. You see, I like you need to go back in the pussy and fuck over. You're so wretched and lousy that you should crawl back into your mother's vagina and be re-upped into existence. Did that make sense? All right. Okay, the admonition, warning of my Aunt Hermione in regard to my lack of interest when I was 14 years old, my lack of interest in wearing underwear. And I can actually still hear all of these people, including my Aunt Hermione, saying this. My dear, I'm just warning you, if you don't wear underwear, you see, you're eventually going to wind up with 2 little shriveled balls that will knock them down for Christmas. That makes sense? Yeah, anyway. A market woman in central Kingston speaking to a drunk man who was begging her for money. Cure out, your face favor pussy when fuck spoil. Get away from me and don't bother me, in English. You're so ugly that you look like a displeased vagina after a particularly bad sexual session. Oh gosh. The response of an elderly, God-fearing, good Christian woman, elderly woman, once again, to an elderly man who had professed a sexual interest in her. So this woman was about, I saw this with my own 2 eyes, when I was about 9 years old. She was about maybe 85 or 86, and he was about maybe 90. And he wanted to have sex with her. And she said, you should be ashamed of yourself, because I can tell you, old woman can always lie down, but old man can't stand up. You should be ashamed of yourself. An old woman can always lie down, but an old man can't always stand up. Yes. Grandmother, my paternal grandmother, having discerned, having understood when I was about maybe 13 that I might be a faggot. Well, baby, I hope that you're not going to be a rear admiral. Rear Admiral, as in, yes, the double entendre in Jamaica. My grandfather on my mother's side, who actually dared to speak about the subject of homosexuality very openly in 1990. This homosexuality, Jesus Christ have mercy, God, what a filthy religion. They are an abomination. Yes, my Aunt Winnie, that's clear I think, my Aunt Winnie, speaking of a man who had not been helpful to her with one of her projects, oh gosh, oh, here we go again with some raunchy stuff. That man, you see, he wouldn't even fart in my ear to clear my brains. This man she's talking about thought so little of her that he wouldn't even fart in her ear to clear out her brains. Right? I don't know where these things come from. Right, but here we are. My mother warning me at about age 13 about the threat of faggots. I notice you seem to have a lot of faggot friends, but be careful around these faggots, you see, because you know they are a very jealous set of people, and they kill accordingly. My mother, after learning that I had made an older friend, a boy about 16 years old when I was 14, one summer in Jamaica, oh yes, an older boy, well my dear, I just hope that he's not one of these older boys who takes young boys and kills them. The belief being that all friendships between older men and younger, well he was not a man, but older men and younger boys must be probably sexually inclined and will lead to the death of the younger boy by murder. My Aunt Genevieve, who told me very frankly, but really and truly, my dear, your being a homosexual is a blessing in disguise. Because just like a woman, you see, you will always be sexually able if you remain on the receiving end. Thank you, Aunt. Yes, okay. A middle-aged woman speaking to two female friends in downtown Kingston. This is very open conversation. And this is also in Patois, and I will translate this afterward into English. Talking about a man whom she decided not to marry. Him not fuck good, him not eat the pussy, and him have no kind of money. How would a blood clot with him can do me? Her friend's response, This man, as far as she was concerned, didn't fuck well. He didn't have any money, and he didn't perform oral sex on her, so what was the point of marrying him? And lastly, very frank, my mother speaking about, and this is very interesting in terms of just spending time in England now, and thinking about the relationship between England and Jamaica in terms of colonialism. This is also in Patois, and I'll translate this for you if you don't get the drift of it. When she was very angry at me at one point when I was about 14 and I forgot to flush the toilet. Look here, no boy, nobody leave no raw soul shit in my bathroom. Even Queen Elizabeth of England must wipe her own raw soul shit and flush the toilet. If the Queen can do it, so can you. Don't leave any shit in my toilet, son, because even the Queen of England has to wipe her own backside and flush the shit down the toilet. If the Queen of England can flush her shit down the toilet, you can as well. Okay.
Thank you, Thomas. I don't think that the rest of the conversation is going to reach that same level. We wanted to hear you speak, and I was asking you to hear you speak in your literary voice first. And one reason is that the Nobel Prize winner, Nadine Gordimer, who died a few days ago, actually praised you, as you know, at one point for your wonderful ear that you have for the way different people speak within their different cultures. And of course, this was a beautiful illustration of all those voices and all those different accents. And of course, you don't only do it with Jamaican characters, but you do it in your other writings as well. I mean, you have a wonderful ear for how exactly people speak and how to reproduce this on the page and also to perform it in front of an audience. So I thought that was a great way to get started. My first question is going to be a very, very obvious one. You have been invited here in the context of a queer arts festival. But we didn't ask you in advance whether you see yourself at all in terms of a queer writer. And if you do so, to what extent you feel that you are a queer writer. Now, as you can imagine, we've been getting questions. This was already being explained in the introduction. We've been getting questions, of course, about what is this whole thing queer? What does it stand for? So what does queer to you mean nowadays? How do you apply that to yourself or to your own work?
what does queer mean nowadays? I mean, that's a really interesting question, particularly in terms of younger people, I think, and I teach in a university as well, so I encounter many students who are queer on Monday, bisexual on Tuesday, heterosexual on Thursday, and bisexual, lesbian, queer, transgender on Saturday. You know, there's a lot of fluidity, I think, more than ever, and that's great, I think. So I watch them and I'm very interested to see how they navigate these different identities. I think, you asked me if I think of myself as a queer writer. I'm not sure anymore. I used to think absolutely that I was absolutely that, very much a queer writer, a black queer writer, a black queer Caribbean, Jamaican writer, etc. And now I'm not sure. There are many stories that I'm interested in telling and looking at. But queerness is always very much an important thing to me, I think, in what I'm looking at with people. And partly, I think, because the stories still, although in 2014, we feel that we have a very kind of modern perspective, many of us, right? And freedom. I think that there are still so many stories that aren't being told, aren't being shared. And as long as things remain like that, I want to try to tell those stories, right? Whether it's in Jamaica or someplace else, right? For that matter, the UK, the US, wherever it might be. So I think someone once asked the question, a playwright I think was asked a question, what is a gay or queer play? And he said, a gay or a queer play is a play that sleeps with plays of the same gender. Right? So maybe that's something that the best that I can do for... but you know, the critics will put this term on one as well, right? And scholars, right, will categorize one in these ways. Yeah, but queer is very important to me. But queer is so fluid and slippery. Right? I think about that myself. What does that mean?
I was a little surprised, or it's probably something interesting to talk about here. I was struck by your extension of the term queer in one of your essays in Among the Black People, and we will be talking mostly about that most recent volume, which is a collection of non-fiction. It's probably more interesting to talk about some of those non-fictional items, rather than about short stories that nobody in the room has read. And so in one of your texts there, you write at one point, and I'm going to quote you here, "Our queerness troubles both questions and notions about absolute categories of sexuality, gender, and race."
I wrote that?
Yes. Page 89. Now, could you explain what you mean by seeing queerness, not just in terms of sexuality and gender, but also in terms of race? Because I think that's an interesting aspect, of course. We're so used to seeing, oh, queer is about sexuality and gender. But I remember also, historically speaking, when the term emerged, it was also about becoming more inclusive, and so it's interesting.
Oh, all right, okay. Okay. By thy own words shall we be hanged, eh? I think it's just very interesting to think about queerness troubling all kinds of absolute categories. I have had to change the way that I think, in fact, because I grew up in a time when, I think there are many young people here tonight, younger people, who think more in terms of queerness than absolute gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. But I had to make a sort of metamorphosis through the time and adapt, you know. And I realized that as I began to see more mixed race categories appearing everywhere, and in my own family, both in the 21st century and in the 20th century and in the 18th and 19th century, my ancestors in Jamaica, dealing with mixed race reality, I began to understand more and more that these absolute categories of race, etc., are not really always useful. They can be useful in political movements, I think, but when I'm writing a story or a piece of nonfiction, etc., I don't want to be pinioned, weighed down by those absolute categories, you know? And at the same time, I think that looking at race and sexuality in Jamaica, one of the things that's really interesting about Jamaica, that might be the case here also in Belgium, where indeed identity is so... I know, I'm thinking identity is so central to so many discussions, right? That's what I was actually thinking about, but also for some people very fluid and for some people not fluid. But I see a similarity between the two countries in that certainly in Jamaica, there's a very fluid kind of sexuality that no one wishes to talk about, right? So there's a lot of underground queer sexuality that people don't wish to talk about, right? And at the same time, race is defined in numerous ways that I think you could say have been queered, if you want to use that word, right? They've been expanded and made more fluid and constantly shifting. Because we can't, the national motto of Jamaica is out of many, one people. I'm not even sure that's true anymore, out of many, one people, maybe out of many, many people, because we have people of so many different colors, coming from so many different places. So I think about queerness in my own past, if you will, by way of race, the fact that I have I've written about him, my great-great-grandfather from Yorkshire, a white man from Yorkshire, who died in Jamaica in 1873. So, and the fact that he stipulated in his will, right, that any of his children, like my great-grandparents, any of his children who married a black person would be disinherited. And he did disinherit one of his children. And by black, he meant dark, right? Now, just there in itself, I think that's fascinating, because here I am in the 21st century, his progeny, as it were, his descendant, right? And I'm dealing with race in a very different way than he did. So I think for a writer dealing with language, if you don't want to be, I'll speak for myself, if I don't want to be held tight around the neck by language that constricts, I think queering can be very advantageous. Going with the more slippery, the more fluid kinds of approaches to language and identity. You know. And I think that that's happening for some people in Belgium as well. That has been happening, although the country is also dealing with absolute identity as well, right? But,
in the introduction to Among the Blood People, Yusef Komunyakaa, who's a famous American poet, describes her book as a blueprint for change in Jamaica. Could you explain the situation for queer people in Jamaica to an audience that probably only has stereotypical associations with the culture of homophobia? And how do you see your own book as a kind of blueprint for change in this regard?
well, I don't know if I agree with Yusef Komunyakaa said this. I'm not sure I agree with him about that, because maybe he's giving me more credit than I can possibly take on. But, I hope that this book will contribute to, and I think it has already contributed to, the discourse in Jamaica for sexual freedom and sexual possibility. But in Jamaica, I was a founding member of the Jamaica Forum for Lesbians, Homosexuals, and Gays in 1998. So that group began as a human rights group to lobby for and work for, really, LGBT rights in Jamaica. We didn't use Q. Queer isn't really used in the Caribbean still, actually. That comes up with the anthology that I did, right? But that word isn't really known or understood in the English-speaking Caribbean, or in the French, or Dutch, or Spanish-speaking Caribbean, or Creole-speaking Caribbean either. We don't really use the word queer. But nonetheless, this group is now, 14, 15 years old, and that was one of the first groups to really deal with the issue publicly of homosexuality, and to try to get Jamaican government and parliament in Jamaica to really take a forthright step to change the situation for queers there. At the same time, we were dealing with human rights infractions against queer people, murders. Jamaica has a very high homicide, murder rate anyway. And within that rate of murder and rape, within that violence is also violence against queers, particularly. So I've written about a few things that have happened in Jamaica in the past, in the recent past. People being burned in their homes, incinerated in their homes, or chopped up with machetes, or beheaded, and this happens occasionally. Or what was popular for a while was gay men being stabbed many, many times, and then their penis chopped off and shoved in their throat, which also one sees done in Colombia in cartel killings. So it's all part of a package. And so in that context, you asked me about the movement in Jamaica, in the social context. So Jamaica is still a very violent country in many ways, generally. But within that violence, I say once again, the violence against queers is very specific. And I think it's interesting to look at. People have asked me how, let's say lesbians, queer women, if you will, what is the kind of, how is violence manifested against lesbians or queer women in Jamaica? And I've often said, and I think this is still true, that the violence against lesbians or queer women in Jamaica would be more a kind of general violence against women, right? So that many women in Jamaica who are inclined to be sexual or romantic or erotic with another woman would be more concerned about general violence against women, irrespective of whether or not they're queer, right? So we don't do corrective rape in Jamaica, as not officially, as South Africa does, but there is such a thing actually as corrective rape in Jamaica for women who are believed to be lesbian, which does happen occasionally when men feel that they can gang rape a woman to the point that that will change her lesbianism. It's a punishment, of course, right? And women, keep in mind too that the majority of the country is poor, and the majority of the country is female. So that means that the majority of the country is poor women, and many of these women are concerned with, whether they're queer or not, they're concerned with things like their children's safety, food, housing, education, healthcare, social services, and so on. Right, which there are really no such services in Jamaica to speak of. So that's kind of, that works that out. So it gets very complicated, and with all of this, also Bart, I think that the difficulty in Jamaica that people often don't take into account, ourselves included in Jamaica, is the social class hierarchy. Because we inherited this from the British. So Jamaica is an extremely class-conscious society, and in fact that affects the queer socializing. At the same time that I'm saying all this to you, just to make this very brief, there is a very vibrant queer life in Jamaica. There has been for decades. And that queer life underground, which is often manifested in parties and gatherings and so on, because you can't really have a gay bar in a place like Jamaica. But this is for Jamaicans, by the way, not necessarily for tourists. It's actually very much for Jamaicans. Tourists are welcome, but it's not geared toward them. But technology has really enabled the life of this social life, this gay queer social life, because of texting and well, maybe Snapchat not so much, but all the various things that people can use now to send messages and convey information. Facebook to some degree as well, right? So even since 10 years ago, I think it's really, really changed. And just one last thing that's very interesting. In Kingston particularly, which is not a tourist city, there are several sex clubs. I lived near one at one point. These are heterosexual sex clubs where women, now more of them from Eastern Europe, but they used to be from other countries, women come and do all kinds of erotic performance, including lesbian performance for a mostly male audience. But what's interesting about those sex clubs is that many lesbians I know have gone there with their girlfriends to watch basically live porn. Right? Yeah, so you see, and no one really minds if they're there. I mean, policemen are sitting in there, judges, and all these people, and no one chases the lesbians out, right? And the other thing, actually, one of the things about, I don't know if to give an entire social context, is that what's very interesting about masculinity, I think, in Jamaica with men, is that very effeminate men, living in very dire situations, often in very poor communities, will actually often be tolerated much more as queers, because they can be laughed at, right? And people understand them. Oh yes, he's a batty man. Batty man, your batty is your backside, your bum. So batty man is like ass man, right? And sodomite is often what lesbians are called as well. So these very effeminate men are often tolerated because they're not really a threat. Right? Oh, that's changing now. That's changing. Many of these effeminate men are being actually kicked out of their homes. Right? So an effeminate man also can have a boyfriend in a ghetto community, a poor community. And the boyfriend could be a gunman, could be a big criminal, and people won't necessarily trouble the boyfriend. Or if they're not afraid of the boyfriend, they might beat the boyfriend when the boyfriend comes there. And women, if they live discreetly, sometimes can have relationships. Someone actually told me, it's okay to be gay in Jamaica, if you have one boyfriend. But you must not have Tom and James and Robert and Frank and I said, okay, so they're saying that basically this very kind of conservative sexuality, right? And the same thing for women. So you see, it's very complex.
Yeah, and one of the things we in queer studies always find very interesting is language, of course. And you've been giving the examples of how language travels differently and the terms are different. And you were bringing up all sexuals as one group. What are all sexuals?
Yes.
It's not a common term.
No, all sexuals came about from the Caribbean Forum of Lesbians, All Sexuals and Gays, which was formed in 1995, which was a pan-Caribbean organization, which didn't last. But they met in Curacao, actually, in the Netherlands Antilles. But out of that meeting came this term, all sexuals. And at that time, we were beginning to deal with the idea of transgender and just queerness in general. and genderqueer and things that we couldn't find language for, that we didn't necessarily want to find language for, and that the people themselves who would be in these categories didn't want to find language for, and we came up with the term all sexuals. Sexual beings who are whatever.
And is it still being used at this point, or is it
Yes.
historic?
Well, it's you mean in daily discourse, in daily life? I don't think that all sexuals is really an actively used term in Jamaica. In Jamaica, no, not really. People are beginning to say transgender, beginning to, right? Transgenderism has always been there, but now it's being understood as a political category, a way that people actually live. But what does transgenderism mean? It can mean so many things, you know?
You explain in a note at the end of the book that recently the situation has been changing somewhat because you now have a prime minister who's more LGBT friendly, at least in what she's been saying. Has there been an evolution in terms of policies? I mean, has she been able to sort of change the discourse a little bit, or has there been very little effective?
Well, Portia Simpson Miller is the prime minister. I was actually in Jamaica when she was elected in, I believe it was December 2011, and she has good intentions, I think, really. There are, of course, rumors about her being a lesbian as well, which is interesting, that she used to have her girlfriends in hotels and so on, and then she stopped. So who knows? In Jamaica, anything is possible. But I think that she has certainly, at least she did say, in contrast to the preceding Prime Minister, Bruce Golding, she did say that she would welcome queers, she didn't say queers, but she said gays and lesbians, into her cabinet, which the preceding Prime Minister, her predecessor, said he would never do that. I think Portia is a wise politician, she's shrewd, and she's seen how things have changed since J. Flab's beginning. But at the same time, she's shrewd enough to know that she probably can't change the Jamaican Parliament. That would be, I think, like really ramming her head against a brick wall. Because those parliamentarians, those members of parliament, are probably in this era, I don't think they're going to vote for the eradication of the laws. They have laws on the books from the 18th century, British colonial laws, which outlaw anal sex between men. You see, interestingly though, right, there's not very much about sex between, there's nothing actually about sex between women, right? So you can still be condemned to 7 years of hard labor for anal sex between men. But women's sexuality is so invisible without a penis. If there's no penis there, it's not real sex, and therefore, who cares? It's pornography. So there's nothing to outlaw women's sexuality in that sense. So Portia is, it's a beginning, I think, yes. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Now, in Among the Blood People, you also write about your perennial search for home. And I was wondering, how difficult is it for a single black gay man living for stretches of time?
Yes, I'm single, but
I'm just taking you as a literary person. For stretches of time, living in different countries, on different continents, how difficult is it to sort of establish a home, find a sense of home? Because you write about that in the book as well.
Yeah, home. I'm beginning to think that actually it's a good thing to always feel unsettled as a writer, because you always have to be attuned to, at least for me, because one always has to be attuned, I always have to be attuned to differences and how people are speaking and thinking, if I can really listen. And one of the best things I think for me to do as a writer is really to listen to people, to the things that they say and that they don't say. I mean, I feel very at home in the UK right now, partly because of, I think, my deeper understanding of the colonial relationship. When I look around at English people, including white people, I say, these are my people, because I realize that there's so many things that they say and do which absolutely remind me of people in my family who were not from England, right, but who lived through colonialism. I also feel very at home in New York, and I feel a little less at home in Jamaica, but it's not really possible to be my complete self there. And I do risk, I mean, it's very dangerous, right, still to be openly gay in Jamaica. So I had one very bad encounter many years ago when I was almost actually killed. And it made me think, this is just something that one has to be very wary of. So home, I don't know, I think home is someplace inside perhaps. I love living in Birmingham, and that feels like home. Birmingham, UK, that's where I live now. And that feels very much like home. Sometimes when I come to Belgium, I stay in Brussels Ibis outside Bruxelles Midi. Brussels Zuid. That feels like home, you know, so it's yeah.
And at the same time, it's interesting to hear you say about those many places that you're able to turn into a home. At the same time, I remember from your book, writing about Cambridge, where you spent, what was it, a year or so as a visiting professor. And then you said that your conclusion was that despite all the magic of Cambridge and all the kind of aura that it has and so forth, it could never be your home.
No, it was a cold-hearted host. I was actually in Cambridge a couple of days ago and visiting a friend who's there at the college where I was. And Cambridge is beautiful, but it's sort of like Paris, cold and haughty and very, very beautiful. So I'm not necessarily criticizing it, but it just felt, it's also a little bit artificial. And I think that many people are very, I don't want to speak too generally, but there's a kind of self-consciousness that I found there. I like things a little bit more down to earth. And so as beautiful as Cambridge was, I think it would be not good for me if I lived there for a very long period of time. In fact, that's why I spent so much time volunteering in London. I told you earlier, I was volunteering for a transgender organization in London where many of the transgender young people, very young, like teenagers, were sleeping homelessly. They were without a home. So I was working with them, and it was very strange, I was saying to Bart earlier, to go down to London and do this work in this office for a few hours, and then return on the train to Cambridge, and I would look at my hands and say, is this the same body, the same person, who was just in that place? Because it felt like a different person from one place to the other. But I appreciated that time very much in Cambridge, and I still feel a connection to some degree to it, I think. Yeah.
Does the British class system have anything to do with that as well?
I think it troubles them more than it troubled me. I think the British themselves are so very much impacted by that class system, especially if one is working class. But I was aware of how Cambridge just architecturally towers over you so much, so you get this feeling of grandeur, and you know that this chapel was built in, I don't know, 1450 by Henry VIII or whomever. There's this sense of history that is very imposing as well, and it actually predates British colonialism. And then you have these beautiful swans that are all owned by the Queen, and so the swans are very aggressive. And so, but no, but I mean it's lovely. I mean it's just a very beautiful countryside.
Do they also wipe their own asses the way the Queen does?
The poor Queen, I should leave her alone. But no, it is. Yeah, I mean the class system certainly plays into. But I learned a great deal there. I think that actually being in Cambridge, I was writing something about some other memories came up from my being in Cambridge, and then later going to Oxford to visit people there and seeing. It was important for me to see how these institutions in Britain have such a powerful impact on the world, certainly in people's imaginations across the world. And I think that I really appreciated my own students back in Binghamton, State University of New York in Binghamton, much more because many of the students in Binghamton are university students, are from working class backgrounds, immigrant backgrounds. Many of them, their parents don't speak English. So many of these students are translating for their parents, whether it's Cantonese, Mandarin, Spanish, any Haitian Creole, and working full-time. And it's very moving to me to see these young people doing all these different things and trying to get their education, and not necessarily taking that for granted. So being in Cambridge for that time was very informative. At the same time, there are many things about it that I loved. And I loved the performances of Shakespeare plays. I mean, I love all that. So I wouldn't throw one thing out with the other.
When I was trying to sum up some of the main topics in your writing, I came up with the formula of the 4 T's. And I'd like to present these 4 T's to you and ask you to explain the relative... Yeah, I have them here, so you don't have to worry. Ask you to explain the relative importance of these topics, maybe also how they became central to your writing and your thinking. So I'd say that your work revolves principally around the following 4 T's: taboos, transgressions, traumas, and tenderness.
Oh.
Would you agree?
Taboos, transgressions, traumas, and I can see why you'd say that. Yes, I can see why you'd say that.
Can you give a couple of examples to the audience here of some of the things that you say, okay, this is something that I wrote on, which is particularly about taboos, or this is about traumas?
Yes, I think I can think about. I think in this book, in Among the Blood People, particularly, I wanted to go out to take more risks than I had in the past. And I think I'd taken risks before. But one thing in terms of taboos, I think that came up for me was if you know the term barebacking, which is when men, gay men or men who have sex with men who are interested in men, have anal sex without a condom. And it's very popular. It's a very popular pastime. And now there are barebacking websites, which there weren't maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I thought that this was something that I really wanted to write about, the feeling that one might have of wanting to bareback, as it were, and even looking at the word, but not using the word in the essay at all. And thinking that there were many gay men, many queer men whom I knew or whom I spent time around, who were feeling very conflicting emotions about this topic and didn't want to talk about any of it. It was actually a taboo. We couldn't talk about it. And nobody who did it, that is, nobody who actually barebacked, was going to necessarily talk about it because they would feel criticized and ashamed. So I wanted to write in the first person about what it was like to actually imagine this, whether or not I myself participated in it. That was certainly one taboo. And then the other taboo, I suppose, was in the Jamaican octopus piece in this book, a piece in which came up it'll come up in something I'm going to read from later in fiction. But I noticed that many, how do I put this without giving away too much? Many men I've heard speaking in privacy, shall we say, have talked about their pussy, right? And talked about how they wanted to be penetrated in their pussy, fucked in their pussy. I don't swear very much, actually. I don't swear at all, so it's very difficult for me to say these words. But they wish to be fucked in their pussy, right? And I thought, well, why is this such a shameful thing? It can only be said in private. And they say it in the most passionate ways, like, please come do this in my pussy, and so on, right? And so I was thinking, well, this is clearly a taboo, so I wanted to write about that as well, and talk about the male pussy and so on, because we never talk about that. And in fact, it was interesting to me some years ago to think about, I said to my students just by chance, they were teaching one day, I said, you know, it's interesting, we always talk about female virginity, but we never talk about male virginity in terms of a male anus. So like a male is an anal virgin. We only think about a male being a virgin by way of his penis, but not by way of his backside, right? And so they were shocked and so on. So we, and then I asked myself, well, why are they shocked? And out of that question came more writing and conversation. Taboo, transgression. Maybe those overlap with transgressions as well. And then trauma. Certainly, there are things that. I mean, it was very interesting watching this film because I'd been in Chile as a student, as an undergraduate student, and I was there actually the year that the Pinochet dictatorship ended in 1991. And one of the things that I was very struck by, I had studied a lot of Chilean history of the 20th century, but I was struck by the fact that I was walking around Santiago, Chile, and other places in that long, narrow country, and seeing people laughing and smiling and joking and talking as if everything were normal. Well, why wouldn't they? Because life goes on. And yet, the country was littered with mass graves. People had been tortured and dismembered and disappeared and shot in firing squads, and all kinds of horrible things had happened, as every country has such a history, one way or another, eventually. And I thought about what does it mean to walk across the land and to live on the land when all these things have happened, when you could be living 5 feet from where a mass grave was. In fact, when I went back to Colombia, the country where I was based that year, someone told me that there was a new apartment building that was being renovated that had previously been a torture and detention center, right, where people from in some of the civil wars and so on, the civil wars as they're called, had been tortured by the army and the most horrendous tortures. And I read a lot about torture, perhaps some of that went to The Torturer's Wife, that book, and other things that I'd written before that. And then tenderness, well, I guess, gosh.
Now you're blushing.
Well, no, I think that it's something that's very important to me, certainly, to read about, it's very interesting to think as a man about this, because I look at I do watch women quite a bit. I have a lot of women friends, but I'm also struck by how it seems as though in so many cultures that I'm familiar with at least, women have the freedom, if you want to call it that, to be very affectionate and to share their feelings and to be able to, they can talk and touch each other's hair and so on and so forth. And men, we're just often denied that freedom. And we can't, even in terms of the colors that we wear, right? And it's nonsense. So I've thought about the kind of tenderness that I'd like to see between men that I might not see in real life necessarily, but maybe I could write about it as an imagined kind of thing. But also tenderness between people in general, I suppose. Right? Because with all the trauma and the transgression, and in that barebacking piece, there's also, I think, some tenderness as well. Yeah.
Okay, final question. I told you that the final question was going to be connection to the city here. So please explain to the audience and to the people who are interested in buying among the blood people what the connection is between the cover image and Antwerp.
Yes, do any of you remember this image from a couple of years ago? Some people do. Any of you? Well, I saw this image when I was coming here. I was coming to Antwerp, I remember, and I was in Brussels station to get the train, and I saw this face in an advert for an exhibition at Muka, right? I didn't know what Muka was at the time. And then I said, oh God, what is that? And I instantly knew when I saw it that I wanted to somehow have this image in my life. I didn't know at that time. I think that might have been 2012 when I was coming to visit your class. So I was actually in Cambridge and I came down from England. And yes, that's right. So then I came to Antwerp, and there the image was again in Antwerp in Centraal, right, in the station. I said, oh, what is this? But I think you came to meet me and you were showing me the clocks and all these different things. And so I was focusing on that, and I said, I've got to make sure that So then I said, okay, we didn't have time. I didn't have time to go to Muga. I didn't think clearly about it. And then I said, I'm coming back to Antwerp to see this image, whatever this is. And I somehow found it online. I think that I wrote down some of the words that I saw, because it was all in Dutch, Flemish, and I wrote down some of the words and Googled them, and then saw that it was an exhibition, and came back to Antwerp to see in September of that year, August, whatever that was, 2012. Now, this book was sold to my publisher that summer, I think July 2012. So I didn't yet have, the book was still a manuscript, you see. And then I said, when I came to Antwerp and I saw the image, I said, okay, now I know why I want this image on the cover of the book. And I'll tell you why, but I wrote to the museum and they were very kind and let me have the image. And actually I'm going there tomorrow to give them a copy of the book, because they still haven't seen the book. But I felt like this image just represented so many things in terms of ancestry and the black world, black people across the world. And it's in many ways Antwerp also, because when I came here the second time, I think, I was telling you, I saw these young, non-white people speaking Dutch. And some of them were teenagers and mixed race couples and white couples and black couples, and they were speaking Dutch and their arms around each other and skateboarding and doing all these things. And nearby the big Ferris wheel, near the train station, I said, oh, it's a whole new world, kind of, it's lovely. And so I said, something about this is telling me this face, come back to Antwerp, take this face, be with the face, think about it, and then put it on the cover of the book. So I'm very grateful to the museum that they let me have it, and the artist that they let me have it. It was in an exhibition for, I should know the man's name, the artist. Say again?
Jimmy Durham?
Yes, Jimmy Durham, who's an American living in Italy. So, and inside the book, indeed, it says, credit to Muka for this image.
And there is a beautiful connection also to the whole festival and the Pride Week here, because you know the title of this sculpture. I looked it up, of course, online. It's called, I don't know why it is in German.
Yes.
It's called Jesus, es geht die Wurst. So it's called like a sausage. And so we have Conchita Wurst, of course. On Sunday, so there's this kind of connection. Okay, do you want to do some more reading, or are we going to...
Do you have time?
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
I can do a brief reading.
Brief reading? Okay, so
yes.
We'll have another brief reading and then we'll conclude and have our conclusion.
Sure, this is also a Jamaican, but it's fiction. And just briefly, you'll hear some very strong Jamaican patois in this. And it's a story from my book, The Torturer's Wife. And just to give you a sense of where we are, a middle-class Jamaican man named Aston sees a black, dark-skinned Jamaican man named Solomon, who's also called Bratty. All Jamaicans have a pet name, an intimate name, Bratty. And Bratty explains to Solomon here in Patois how he got the name Bratty. And I'll translate the Patois afterward, and then you'll hear some of Solomon's thoughts. You'll hear some of Aston's thoughts about Bratty, what he thinks of him. So here, Solomon is telling Aston how he got this name of Bratty. My uncle, Solomon had told Aston very early on. That was my mother, brother. And then all the while time my mother said that me would go to be one spoiled up picnic, because she never one day caned me. Even when we run up and down the road with all the other boy there, round the place so. And then always tell her, say, you got spoil that the boy there. And then said to her, so did stay, always vex her, Solomon had said, laughing. And then always that kind of fenke. But trust me did know say I was a good man, a good Christian. So now one Sunday morning, when we make myself ready to go to church, and they start to call me Bratty. And they said to me, you was one little bratty boy. And they said to me upon the road. So the name kind of stick, and from that time, all the boys in town did follow him up and start from then to call me Bratty. It's so them call me till now. But my true name my mother gave me is Solomon, for true. So he's saying there, my uncle gave me this name, and he was saying that I was a spoiled child, and that my mother was going to spoil me if she didn't use the cane, as they do still in Jamaica, and beat me more. He was always a fenke uncle. Fenke is a person who's very particular and kind of fussy and strict. And so one Sunday morning when the family was going to church, the uncle said to him, Bratty, you little bratty boy, right? And from that time began to call him Bratty. But the true name that his mother gave him, Solomon's mother gave him, was the name Solomon, for true. And your true name, you hear the repetition of fenke, true, or words like dege, things like this, right? And here, in this section, in this paragraph, you hear the feelings that Aston has sexually about Bratty. Aston, by the way, is married, and he's a brown Jamaican man, so like my color, brown, not black, right? Looking at Solomon. And so, of course, Aston had never told anyone that, yes, of course, he had always wanted, really and truly, above all, to curl his fingers around Solomon's surely grape-sized black balls, and squeeze his hand around the surely plantain-thick, banana-thick, uncircumcised black hood. Hood is a slang term for cock in Jamaica. Uncircumcised black hood. Uncircumcised, of course, especially with country people. And rub that hood. Rub it, after which he would raise his hand to his face to sniff and lick and suck what he knew would be the strong roadside sweat crotch smell. Pure hood. Then pull that hood that was not brown like his own, but black as the ace of Ross-cloth spades, he thought. Swear word, Ross-cloth. Stiffening more at the thought. How much stiffer could he get before his own hood tore a path through his zipper? Pull it, the fisherman's road-sweaty, sea-salty, rancid cock, into his mouth, in order to taste and suck sweat and strong hood smell, and Bratty's charging heat that would have jetted so powerfully out of that engorged black manhood. And yes, of course, he had imagined Solomon, Bratty, filling his throat, and then, of course, taking him from behind. Solomon's hood deep inside what he would have liked very much to have called his pussy, shouting in his most dangerous, unspeakable imagination, words like, Bratty, come breed me. Bratty, brethren, come fuck me now, Bratty. Come and grind your cocky hot in my pussy hole. Solomon's black manhood filling up his pussy and roughing it in a way nothing his wife nor any other woman would have been able to do. And then all the kisses that Bratty would have bestowed upon him, kisses bestowed mouth to mouth, as Bratty threw his fisherman's arms around him and held him, and. When I say bratty brethren is brethren, so bratty brethren, come fuck me now, and grind your cocky, hot, I think we got that part. Come breed me is breed me like make me pregnant, right? Which I've heard people say, come breed me now, breed me in a pussy hole, right? Come breed me. So this is, of course, again, I think going back to taboo. And it's never been written in Jamaican literature that I know of, so I wanted to explore it.
Okay, thank you.
For being with us tonight. De mensen van Boekhandel Verschil staan hier buiten en er zijn onder meer werken te koop van Thomas Glave. Dus wie een gesigneerd exemplaar wil, is het moment. We gaan een kwartiertje pauzeren. Na de pauze hebben wij Maud van Houwaard bij ons om ons met poëzie de nacht in te sturen. Ik vertel u straks wie ze is. Ze heeft onder meer, ze was een van de laureaten van het cabaretfestival, het Leids Cabaretfestival. Dus dat zegt meteen iets van wat ze waard is. Straks na de pauze maken we kennis.